The morning sunlight streamed through my kitchen window, casting long shadows across the mahogany table that Richard and I had picked out together 30 years ago. I remember how proud we were when we could finally afford real wood furniture, not the particle board pieces we'd started our marriage with. My hands trembled as I stared at the manila envelope that had arrived with our usual stack of anniversary cards and well wishes from friends and family. 50 years. Today was supposed to be our golden anniversary. I had woken up early, as I always did, to make Richard's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, the expensive kind he loved but claimed we couldn't afford. I had already laid out his best suit, the navy one that brought out his eyes, and placed his anniversary gift on his nightstand, a vintage pocket watch I'd been saving for months to buy. The house was decorated with photos from our 5 decades together, our wedding day in 1975, the birth of our children, Sophia and Michael, family vacations, holidays, birthdays. But Richard wasn't coming down for breakfast. He'd left before dawn, claiming an urgent business meeting with Grace, his secretary turned business partner, on our anniversary. When I'd asked him about it last night, he'd barely looked up from his phone. Elena, the business doesn't stop because you're feeling sentimental about some arbitrary date. Arbitrary date? Our wedding anniversary was arbitrary. I had pushed down the familiar ache in my chest and focused on preparing for our celebration dinner. 50 people were coming tonight. Our children flying in from across the country. Grandchildren, old friends, neighbors who'd watched our love story unfold over half a century. I'd spent weeks planning the menu, polishing the silver, addressing invitations by hand because Richard said it was more personal that way. The envelope sat innocuously between a card from our grandson Tommy and an invitation to our neighbor's retirement party. My name was written in Richard's familiar handwriting, the same careful script that had penned love letters during his deployment to Vietnam, that had signed birthday cards for 49 years, that had written "Forever Yours" in my wedding album. Inside were divorce papers, official, legal, stamped documents that dissolved 50 years of marriage with clinical precision. But it wasn't just the divorce papers that made my world tilt sideways. It was the date on Richard's signature, March 15th, 2024. Exactly 1 year ago. Not today, not last week, not even last month, an entire year ago. I sat there in my yellow cotton robe, the one Richard always complained made me look like a faded daffodil, staring at proof that while I'd been planning our golden anniversary celebration, while I'd been holding his hand through chemotherapy appointments, while I'd been defending him to worried friends who whispered that he seemed different, he had already signed away our marriage. My wedding ring, the simple gold band he'd placed on my finger 50 years ago with shaking hands and tears in his eyes, caught the morning light. I twisted it around my finger, the same nervous habit I developed as a young bride, except now my finger was thinner, the ring looser, just like everything else in my life had become. 50 years. 50 years I stood by this man through his cancer diagnosis, through the bankruptcy that nearly cost us our home, through his nightmares from the war that would wake us both in the middle of the night. Today, on what should have been our golden anniversary, I discovered he'd been planning his escape for an entire year. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The pancakes were getting cold, but for the first time in decades, I didn't care about the mess. Looking back now, I can see how naive I was to believe in fairy tales. But in 1975, when I was 25 and Richard was 27, our love story felt like something straight out of a movie. I was working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital, exhausted from 12-hour days of caring for patients who reminded me daily how fragile life could be. Richard was a construction foreman then building the new wing of our hospital. And every night around midnight, he'd appear in the cafeteria with 2 cups of coffee and that crooked smile that made my heart skip. "You look like you could use a friend," he'd said that first night, sliding a steaming cup across the table to me. His hands were rough from years of construction work, calloused and strong. But when he handed me that coffee, his touch was gentle. We'd sit together during my 30-minute break talking about everything and nothing, his dreams of starting his own construction company, my plans to maybe become a nurse practitioner someday, the books we were reading, the places we wanted to travel. He'd wait for me in the parking lot after my shifts, leaning against his beat-up pickup truck with wildflowers he'd picked from whatever job site he was working on. Dandelions, Queen Anne's lace, sometimes just interesting weeds that caught his eye. "Every woman deserves flowers," he'd say, tucking them behind my ear, "even if they're not fancy enough for a florist shop." I'd drive home to my tiny apartment with those roadside bouquets on my passenger seat, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. Our courtship lasted 8 months. 8 perfect months of stolen moments between my shifts and his work schedule. He'd leave little notes tucked under my windshield wipers, quotes from poetry books he'd check out from the library, silly drawings of us as stick figures, promises of the life we'd build together. "Elena," one note read, "when I see you, I see home." Our wedding was small, but perfect. We couldn't afford much. My dress was borrowed from my cousin Maria. His suit was rented, and our reception was in the church basement with food prepared by our families. But when Father Joseph pronounced us husband and wife, when Richard kissed me in front of God and everyone we loved, I felt like I had everything I'd ever wanted. The plan was simple. I'd keep working while Richard saved money to start his construction business. We'd pool our resources, live frugally, and build something together. But 3 months after our wedding, Richard came home with spreadsheets and calculations spread across our kitchen table. "Elena, honey, I've been running the numbers," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "If you quit nursing and help me full-time, keep the books, answer phones, handle the business side, we could launch Martinez Construction 6 months ahead of schedule. You're so much better with organization than I am. You'd be my partner in everything." The idea thrilled me. Partners in everything. I'd grown up watching my mother support my father's dreams, and she'd always told me that's what marriage was: 2 people building something bigger than what either could create alone. Within a week, I'd given my notice at the hospital, hung up my stethoscope, and transformed our spare bedroom into an office for Martinez Construction. Those early years were magical. Richard and I worked side by side, building his company from nothing. I kept meticulous records, scheduled jobs, handled payroll, and when Sophia was born 2 years later, I learned to balance a baby on my hip while typing invoices. Michael came 3 years after that, and somehow I managed to raise 2 children while growing our business. "Look what we built," Richard would say, gesturing at our growing company, our beautiful home, our perfect family. And I'd beam with pride, knowing I'd helped create it all. I thought we were a team. I thought love meant sacrifice. I had no idea I was slowly erasing myself. The call came on a Tuesday morning in September 2019. I was in the kitchen preparing Richard's favorite lunch, turkey sandwiches with extra mustard, the way his mother used to make them. When Dr. Patterson's office called with the results of Richard's routine physical, his PSA levels were elevated. Significantly elevated. "Mrs. Martinez, we need Mr. Martinez to come in immediately for additional testing," the nurse said, her voice carrying that careful, professional tone I remembered from my own nursing days. The tone that meant serious, but not panicked. Not yet. I found Richard in his study, hunched over construction blueprints, with reading glasses perched on his nose. At 70, he was still handsome in that rugged way that had first caught my attention, though his dark hair had gone silver and his frame had thickened around the middle. When I told him about the call, he barely looked up. "Schedule it for next week, Elena. I've got the Henderson project deadline breathing down my neck." "Richard," they said immediately. "Nothing's that immediate. These doctors just want to squeeze more money out of us." But I could see the fear flicker across his face before he buried it behind bravado. I made the appointment for the next morning and spent that night researching prostate cancer, printing articles, making lists of questions to ask the doctor. This was what I did. I prepared, I organized, I took care of everything so Richard could focus on healing. The diagnosis came 3 days later. Stage 2 prostate cancer. Aggressive but treatable. Dr. Patterson explained the options: surgery, radiation, hormone therapy. While I took careful notes and Richard stared out the window, I squeezed his hand, whispering reassurances, planning our battle against this disease the way we tackled every challenge in our 44-year marriage together. But something had changed in Richard, something subtle that I couldn't quite identify at first. He'd always been a man who commanded attention, who filled a room with his presence. Now, even as I devoted myself entirely to his care, he seemed to be withdrawing from me specifically while becoming more animated with everyone else. It started with the phone calls. Richard had always taken business calls in his study, but now the calls came at all hours during dinner, late at night, early in the morning. When I'd ask about them, he'd dismiss my concern with increasing irritation. "It's Grace handling the Peterson contract negotiations," he'd say, not looking up from his phone. "The business doesn't stop because I'm sick, Elena." Grace Chen had been Richard's secretary for 15 years, an efficient woman in her mid-30s who'd recently been promoted to office manager. I'd always liked her. She was organized, professional, and had helped streamline our business operations considerably. But now, her name seemed to pepper every conversation. "Grace thinks I should try the new oncologist at Presbyterian." Grace found this article about alternative treatments. Grace says her uncle beat prostate cancer with a positive attitude. The morning of Richard's first chemotherapy appointment, I was in the bathroom getting ready when I heard him laughing in the bedroom. Not the careful, brave laughter of a man trying to stay positive, but genuine, delighted laughter. I peeked around the door frame to see him texting on his phone, grinning like a teenager. "What's so funny?" I asked, applying lipstick with shaking hands. I was more nervous about his treatment than he seemed to be. His smile disappeared instantly. "Nothing you'd understand, Elena. You never did get my sense of humor." The words hit me like a physical blow. In 44 years of marriage, Richard had never spoken to me with such casual cruelty. I stood there in my careful outfit, the blue dress he'd once said brought out my eyes, feeling suddenly foolish and old. "I was just trying to share the moment with you," I said quietly. "Not everything is about you, Elena. Can a man have privacy even when he's dying?" He wasn't dying. Dr. Patterson had been very clear about his excellent prognosis. But Richard wielded his diagnosis like a weapon, and I found myself apologizing for existing in my own marriage. The chemotherapy sessions became a theater of my own invisibility. Every Tuesday and Friday for 12 weeks, I'd drive Richard to the cancer center in our Honda, the car I'd been driving for 8 years because Richard said we needed to be practical while he drove the newer pickup truck for business purposes. I'd pack a bag with his favorite snacks, magazines, a soft blanket, everything I thought might make him more comfortable during the 3-hour treatments. The oncology ward was a place where people came stripped of pretense, where illness was the great equalizer. But somehow, even there, I became background noise in my own husband's life. Richard would light up when the nurses approached, especially the younger ones. Nurse Jennifer with her bright smile and gentle hands. Nurse Amanda, who always complimented his positive attitude. Nurse Sarah, who laughed at his jokes and called him a fighter. "Mr. Martinez, you're looking strong today," Jennifer would say, and Richard would straighten in his chair, suddenly animated in a way I hadn't seen at home in months. "Well, you know what they say, too stubborn to die," he'd respond with that charming grin that had first captivated me 50 years ago. They'd chat about his construction projects, her nursing school experience, the weather, current events, real conversations. Meanwhile, I sat in the corner chair like a piece of furniture, holding his jacket and water bottle, occasionally offering a comment that would be met with polite nods before the conversation flowed around me again. The drive home was always silent. Richard would scroll through his phone, responding to messages with the kind of enthusiasm he used to reserve for talking with me. When I tried to engage him, asking how he felt, if he needed anything, whether he wanted to stop for his favorite ice cream, his responses became increasingly clipped.
"I'm fine, Elena."
"I don't need anything. I'm not a child who needs treats." At home, the pattern intensified. The phone calls with Grace became daily occurrences, sometimes lasting hours. I'd hear him laughing from behind his closed study door, his voice animated and engaged in ways that our own conversations never achieved anymore. When I'd knock to offer him tea or ask about dinner, he'd wave me away impatiently. "Grace and I are discussing the quarterly projections." "Elena, this is important." Important. The word became a knife that cut deeper each time he used it. Our 44 years together weren't important. My questions about his health weren't important. My presence in his life had somehow become unimportant. While Grace's opinions on everything from his treatment options to his business decisions carried weight I could never achieve. I started noticing how he'd perk up when Grace's name appeared on his phone screen. How he'd excuse himself from family dinners to take her calls. How he'd quote her opinions as if they were gospel truth. Grace thinks the new treatment protocol sounds promising. Grace says I shouldn't let the side effects slow me down. Grace found this article about men who beat cancer and came back stronger than ever. Meanwhile, my own research, hours spent reading medical journals, finding support groups, connecting with other cancer families, was dismissed as Elena's worrying. When I'd share information I'd found, he'd barely glance at the articles I'd printed and highlighted. "You're always so anxious about everything," he'd say. "Grace keeps telling me I need to stay positive, not get bogged down in all the doom and gloom scenarios you keep finding." I began to feel like a ghost haunting my own marriage. I cooked meals he barely acknowledged, cleaned a house he didn't notice, managed his medication schedule he never thanked me for. When friends called to check on him, he'd talk for 20 minutes about his amazing support team at work and Grace's invaluable help while I stood nearby wondering when I'd stopped being part of his story. The cruelest part was how obvious it became that I was performing love for an audience of one, myself. Richard had already checked out of our marriage. I just hadn't received the memo yet. The Willowbrook Country Club's annual charity gala had always been one of our favorite events. For 23 years, Richard and I had attended together, me in my best dress and him in his navy suit, dancing to the same band and bidding on silent auction items we couldn't quite afford but bought anyway for good causes. It was one of the few places where we still felt like the couple we used to be, or at least where I still pretended we were. This year felt different from the moment we arrived. Richard had insisted on driving separately, claiming he needed to network with potential clients and didn't want to be tied down to Elena's schedule. I'd arrived alone in my Honda, wearing the emerald green dress Sophia had sent me for Christmas, the first new formal wear I'd owned in 5 years. Richard had barely glanced at me when I'd modeled it for him at home. "It's fine, Elena. Very appropriate for your age." Appropriate for my age. At 68, I was apparently too old to be beautiful, too old to be desirable, too old to be anything more than appropriate. The ballroom was decorated in gold and white, elegant and warm with soft lighting that made everyone look younger. I'd volunteered to help with decorations earlier that week, spending hours arranging centerpieces and hanging lights, the kind of behind-the-scenes work I'd always done without recognition or thanks. Now, watching other couples dance and laugh together, I felt like I was observing a life I used to live. Richard was holding court near the bar with his usual group, his golf buddies from the club, a few business associates, and Grace, who looked stunning in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She'd position herself at Richard's elbow, laughing at his stories, touching his arm when she made points, playing the role I'd once occupied in his social circle. I was returning from the ladies' room, walking through the dimly lit corridor that ran behind the ballroom, when I heard familiar laughter coming from an alcove near the coat check. Richard's voice, warm and animated in a way I rarely heard anymore, was regaling his audience with what sounded like another one of his famous stories. "The thing about marriage," Richard was saying, his voice carrying that performative quality he used when he wanted to be the center of attention, "is that it's like buying a car. In the beginning, you're so proud of it. You wash it every weekend, show it off to your friends, take it on special trips." More laughter from his audience. I pressed myself against the wall, hidden in shadows, my heart already beginning to sink. "But after 50 years, Richard continued, "well, Elena's like an old sweater. Comfortable, but not something you'd wear out anymore. She's functional, reliable, keeps the house warm, but you wouldn't want her friends to see you in it." The group erupted in laughter. Tom Henderson, Richard's golf partner, slapped him on the back. "Jesus, Rick, you're terrible."
"But I get it, man."
"My wife's the same way. Great for around the house, but when you want to feel young again, some men deserve better than comfortable." Grace's voice cut through the laughter, smooth and confident. I watched through the gap in the wall as she placed her manicured hand on Richard's arm, her touch lingering longer than necessary. They deserve to feel alive, appreciated, desired. Richard nodded thoughtfully, as if this was some profound revelation rather than a calculated insult to his wife of 50 years. Grace gets it. She understands that a man needs more than just maintenance in his life. To being more than comfortable, Tom raised his whiskey glass in a mock toast, and the entire group joined in, including Richard, including Grace, all of them laughing at the joke of my existence. I stood frozen behind that wall, my emerald dress suddenly feeling like a costume I was too old to wear. My wedding ring burned against my finger, like a brand of ownership rather than love. 50 years of sacrifice, of putting his dreams before mine, of shrinking myself to make room for his ambitions, and I'd become a punchline, an old sweater, something comfortable but embarrassing. The worst part wasn't the cruelty. It was the casual nature of it, how easily they dismissed half a century of my life, as if it meant nothing at all. The shift happened gradually, like ice forming on a lake, so slow you don't notice until suddenly everything is frozen solid. After Richard's cancer went into remission that spring, instead of gratitude for the woman who'd held his hand through every treatment, driven him to every appointment, and researched every possible outcome, he seemed to resent my very presence. It was as if my witness to his vulnerability had become an embarrassment he needed to eliminate. The criticism started small and grew more vicious with each passing week. My cooking, which had satisfied him for 49 years, was suddenly too bland or too salty or not what Grace recommended from that new health blog she follows. My appearance, which I'd tried to maintain despite the stress of caregiving, became a constant source of commentary. "Elena, that lipstick makes you look desperate," he'd say as I got ready for church. "And maybe try something other than those cardigans." Grace was just saying how important it is for women our age to stay current. Grace. Always Grace. Her opinions had become his gospel, her preferences his new standard for everything from my wardrobe to my personality. When I'd point out that I'd been managing our household successfully for 5 decades, he'd roll his eyes. "The world has changed. Elena, you're stuck in 1975. Grace understands modern life, modern business, modern relationships." Modern relationships. The phrase stung because I knew exactly what he meant. Relationships where women were decorative rather than devoted, exciting rather than reliable, temporary rather than permanent. The breaking point came during a family dinner in late July. Sophia had driven down from Chicago with her husband and our 2 grandsons, and Michael had flown in from Seattle with his family. It was rare to have everyone together, and I'd spend days preparing Richard's favorite meal, pot roast with all the sides he'd loved since our early married years. But throughout dinner, Richard acted like a stranger forced to endure boring company. He checked his phone constantly, answered with one-word responses when the children tried to engage him, and made pointed comments about people who never grew beyond their small-town mentalities. When 8-year-old Tommy spilled his milk, Richard snapped with disproportionate anger. "Jesus Christ, Elena, can't you teach these kids basic table manners?" This is exactly why Grace says family dinners are overrated, chaos, and mess. The table went silent. Sophia's face flushed with anger, and Michael's jaw tightened. But it was Tommy's confused, hurt expression that broke something inside me. This sweet child who adored his grandfather was being yelled at for being 8 years old. "Dad," Sophia said quietly, her lawyer voice carefully controlled. "Why are you being so mean to Mom? She's been taking care of you for months, and now you're treating her like she's done something wrong." Richard's response was swift and cutting. "Your mother chose to be ordinary, Sophia. She chose to be comfortable with a small life, small dreams, small everything. Don't make the same mistake. Look at Grace. She's built something meaningful with her life. She has ambitions beyond cooking pot roast and watching game shows." The words hung in the air like poison gas. I felt every person at that table staring at me, my children horrified, my grandchildren confused, my son-in-law uncomfortable. 50 years of marriage reduced to ordinary and small in front of the people I loved most. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking, and began clearing plates with mechanical precision. "I'm sorry dinner wasn't good enough," I said quietly. "I'll try to do better next time." But there wouldn't be a next time, and somehow we all knew it. That night, I moved my belongings to the guest room. Not dramatically, not with arguments or demands for explanations. I simply gathered my pillow, my reading glasses, the novel I'd been trying to finish for months, and relocated to the small bedroom at the end of the hall. The room that had once been Michael's, then our office, now my exile. Richard didn't comment on my absence from our bed. If anything, he seemed relieved. I stopped trying to engage him in conversation about his day, stopped asking about his business meetings, stopped offering opinions about decisions that apparently no longer included me. When Mrs. Torres asked why I looked so tired, I couldn't tell her the truth, that I was disappearing inside my own life. The isolation crept in like a slow-moving fog, so gradual that I didn't realize how completely it had enveloped me until I was drowning in it. It started with the bank account. Our joint checking account that I'd managed for 50 years suddenly required Richard's signature for any transaction over $50. He claimed it was temporary, just for tax purposes, while Grace helped him restructure our finances for optimal efficiency. "You understand, don't you, Elena?" he'd said, not looking up from his laptop. "Grace has an MBA in financial management. She's found some loopholes that could save us thousands." What I understood was that I couldn't buy groceries without asking permission. The woman who had built Martinez Construction's bookkeeping system from scratch, who had balanced our books through recessions and expansions, who had stretched every dollar during the lean years, now had to request $20 for milk and bread like a child asking for an allowance. The first time I had to call Sophia and ask her to transfer money for groceries, I lied. "It's just a temporary banking issue, sweetheart." Something about new security measures. The shame burned in my throat as I spoke. Sophia immediately sent $200, but the transaction felt like begging, like I was becoming a burden to my own children. My world began to shrink in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without access to our accounts, I couldn't maintain the small freedoms that had made my life bearable. No more coffee dates with Mrs. Torres at the little cafe downtown. No more spontaneous purchases of flowers for the kitchen table. No more charitable donations to the church fundraisers I'd supported for decades. Even my hair appointments became a luxury I had to justify to Richard, who would question every expense with the scrutiny of an accountant auditing a stranger's books. $80 for a haircut. Grace goes to a very reputable salon for half that price.
Grace.
Even my appearance was now subject to Grace's invisible standards. The house, which had once been my sanctuary, became my prison. I'd wake up at dawn out of habit, make Richard's coffee, and watch him leave for work without a word. Then I'd stand in our kitchen, the kitchen I designed with cabinets I'd chosen and countertops I'd saved for, feeling like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. I started cleaning obsessively. Every surface got scrubbed twice. Every room reorganized. Every closet emptied and refilled with military precision. I'd spend hours polishing furniture that was already spotless, rearranging books that didn't need rearranging, washing clothes that were already clean. The physical activity was the only thing that kept the panic at bay, the only way to prove I was still useful, still necessary. But Richard barely noticed. He'd come home, eat the dinner I'd prepared with mechanical efficiency, then disappear into his study for important calls with Grace about the Morrison project or strategy sessions about the new commercial contracts. I'd sit alone in our living room watching television shows I didn't care about, waiting for a conversation that never came. The silence became deafening. Some days I realized I hadn't spoken to another human being since Richard left that morning. I started having conversations with myself while cleaning just to hear a human voice in the house. I'd comment on the weather to my reflection in the bathroom mirror, discuss grocery lists with the empty kitchen, ask the photographs on the mantel how their day was going. One particularly dark Tuesday in November, I found myself standing in front of our landline phone at 3 in the afternoon, dialing my own voicemail just to hear someone say my name. "You've reached Elena Martinez. Please leave a message." The sound of my own voice speaking my own name was the only human connection I'd had all day. I called back 3 more times just to hear proof that I still existed. That evening, when Richard came home 2 hours late from another business dinner that smelled suspiciously like Grace's perfume, I tried to tell him about my day, about the book I was reading, about the cardinals that had built a nest in our oak tree, about anything that might spark a moment of connection. "That's nice, Elena," he said, scrolling through his phone. Grace and I had the most interesting discussion about expanding into commercial real estate. She has some fascinating insights about market trends. I sat there on our couch, invisible in my own living room, and realized I had become a ghost haunting my own life. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday morning in early March, tucked between utility bills and grocery store circulars. Elegant cream-colored cardstock with gold embossed lettering announced the upcoming golden wedding anniversary celebration of Richard and Elena Martinez. 50 years of marriage, the invitation proclaimed, deserved a proper celebration. I stared at the invitation I designed and ordered months earlier when I still believed we had something worth celebrating. 60 people had already RSVP'd. Our children, grandchildren, lifelong friends, neighbors who'd watched our love story unfold over 5 decades. The caterer was booked, the flowers ordered, the photographer scheduled. In 6 weeks, we'd stand before everyone we loved and pretend our marriage was worth honoring. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was planning a celebration of a union that felt more like a prison sentence, decorating for a party that might be the final performance of my 50-year charade. Richard had been even more absent than usual lately, claiming major business restructuring required his constant attention. Grace was helping him modernize operations and explore new market opportunities. He'd leave before I woke up and return after I'd gone to bed, communicating only through notes left on the kitchen counter about his schedule or food preferences. That afternoon, I decided to tackle his study, the one room in our house that had become completely off-limits to me. "It's my private workspace, Elena," he'd said when I'd offered to help organize his papers. Grace had set up a filing system that made sense for our business needs. But today, with the anniversary party looming and a growing pile of vendor contracts that needed Richard's signature, I couldn't wait for his permission anymore. The catering deposit was due, the florist needed confirmation, and the rental company required a signed agreement. I needed access to our checkbook, which Richard kept locked in his desk drawer. The study felt foreign despite being in my own home. Gone were the family photos that had once lined his bookshelves, replaced by business awards and industry magazines. His desk, which used to be cluttered with blueprints and coffee-stained notepads, was now pristine and organized with labeled folders and color-coded filing systems that looked nothing like the chaos I'd helped to manage for 30 years. I found the spare key to his desk drawer, exactly where he'd always kept it, taped under the edge of his bladder, the same hiding spot he'd used since our children were toddlers who might get into important papers. Some habits, at least, hadn't changed. The checkbook was there along with business contracts, vendor invoices, and a thick manila folder labeled Personal Confidential in Grace's neat handwriting. Something about that folder made my stomach clench. Grace's handwriting on Richard's personal documents felt like another small invasion. Another piece of territory I'd lost without realizing it. Inside the folder was a letter from Thornton Williams & Associates, our family lawyer's office, dated March 15, 2024, almost exactly 1 year ago. The letterhead was familiar. David Thornton had handled our wills, our business incorporation, and the purchase of our home. But this letter wasn't about routine legal matters. It was a detailed outline of divorce proceedings, complete with asset division proposals, custody arrangements for our shared business interests, and a timeline for filing. Attached were property assessments for our home, our vacation cabin, and Richard's construction company. Every asset we'd built together over 50 years had been cataloged, evaluated, and prepared for division. But it was the financial analysis that made my hands shake. Page after page of bank statements, investment accounts, and business valuations, all showing a systematic transfer of assets into accounts bearing only Richard's name. Money from joint accounts had been moved to individual ones. Business profits that should have been equally shared had been redirected through shell corporations that listed Grace as a co-owner. The most devastating discovery was buried in the middle of the file: travel itineraries for Richard and Grace. Not business trips to construction sites or industry conferences, but romantic getaways to Tuscany, weekend retreats to Napa Valley, intimate dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of. The most recent itinerary was for a 2-week trip to Italy scheduled for the week immediately following our anniversary party. They were planning to leave for a romantic vacation the day after we celebrated 50 years of marriage. At the bottom of the file, like a signature on my death warrant, were the actual divorce papers. While I'd been nursing him through cancer, while I'd been defending him to worried friends, while I'd been planning our golden anniversary celebration, he'd already legally ended our marriage. I'd been living in a performance, playing the role of devoted wife in a marriage that had been officially terminated a year ago. The papers trembled in my hands as I realized the scope of his deception. This wasn't a recent decision born of midlife crisis or sudden unhappiness. This was a calculated, methodical plan executed over years with Grace's help and our lawyer's complicity. I sat in Richard's chair, the leather chair I'd given him for his 60th birthday, surrounded by evidence of my own erasure. And for the first time in months, I felt something other than sadness. I felt angry. I sat in Father Joseph's office the next morning, the manila folder clutched in my trembling hands like evidence of a crime, which in many ways it was. The small room smelled of old books and lemon oil, the same comforting scent that had surrounded me during confession for 43 years. But today, I wasn't here to confess my sins. I was here to confront the magnitude of someone else's betrayal. Father Joseph had been our priest since 1982, the man who'd married us when we renewed our vows for our 25th anniversary, who'd baptized our grandchildren, who'd given Richard last rites when we thought the cancer might win. At 78, he'd seen enough human frailty to handle almost anything. But his face went pale as I spread the divorce papers across his desk. "Elena," he said softly, his Irish accent still thick after 50 years in America. "How long have you known?" "Since yesterday afternoon." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, steadier than I'd expected, clearer than I'd felt in months. "Father, I keep asking myself what I did wrong. Was I not devoted enough? Not supportive enough during his illness? Not young enough, not pretty enough, not interesting enough?" I'd spent the entire night pacing our house, questioning every decision I'd made over 5 decades. Should I have gone back to nursing when the children left home? Should I have insisted on couples counseling when Richard started becoming distant? Should I have fought harder for his attention instead of quietly accepting my growing invisibility? Father Joseph removed his reading glasses and looked at me with the same gentle expression he'd worn when comforting our family during every crisis we'd faced. "Elena, child, you're asking the wrong questions." "What do you mean?" "You keep asking what you did wrong. As if loving someone completely, sacrificing your own dreams for theirs, standing by them through sickness and financial ruin, as if those are somehow failures." He gestured to the papers spread between us. "This man has been planning his escape for over a year while you've been planning your anniversary celebration. You gave 50 years of your life to someone who was already writing your farewell letter." The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow, but not the crushing kind I'd been enduring for months. This felt different, clarifying, liberating even. "The question isn't what you did wrong, Elena. The question is what you're going to do right." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something I'd almost forgotten. The competent, capable woman I'd been before I started shrinking myself to fit Richard's diminishing opinion of me. The nurse who could handle any medical emergency with calm efficiency. The woman who'd built a business from nothing while raising 2 children. The person who'd managed every crisis our family had faced for 50 years. "Father, what would you do if you discovered someone had been stealing from the church collection for a year?" He raised an eyebrow at my change of tone. "I'd document everything, involve the proper authorities, and ensure it never happened again. Even if that person was someone you'd trusted completely, someone you'd served faithfully for decades." "Elena, trust that's been deliberately broken isn't the same as trust that's been damaged by mistake. One can be repaired. The other is a choice to continue being victimized." I gathered the papers methodically, my movements precise and purposeful for the first time in months. "Father, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, of course. When you married us 50 years ago, when you watched us build our life together, did you ever imagine Richard was capable of this level of deception?" Father Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. Elena, I've learned that people are capable of extraordinary kindness and extraordinary cruelty, sometimes within the same heart. But what matters isn't what Richard is capable of. It's what you're capable of. What am I capable of? He smiled. And for the first time in months, I felt seen by another human being. You're capable of surviving this. You're capable of rebuilding. You're capable of remembering that Elena Martinez existed before Richard, and she'll exist after him, too. Walking back to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: curiosity about my own future. For 50 years, my tomorrow had been defined entirely by Richard's needs, Richard's plans, Richard's dreams. Now, suddenly, tomorrow belonged to me. The woman who'd once managed a household, raised children, and co-built a business while keeping everyone's lives running smoothly. That woman was still here. She'd just been buried under decades of being told she wasn't enough. It was time to excavate her. The phone call to Sophia was the hardest conversation I'd had in 50 years of motherhood. I sat in my Honda outside Father Joseph's church, my hand shaking as I dialed her number, knowing that once I spoke these words aloud, there would be no pretending anymore that my marriage was salvageable. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound strange." "Sophia, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." I took a deep breath and spoke the words that felt like breaking a spell. "Your father filed for divorce a year ago. I found the papers yesterday." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice had transformed into the steely tone she used in court when facing particularly despicable opponents. "What do you mean he filed a year ago? Mom, that's impossible. You would have been served papers. There would have been court dates." The papers were in his study along with financial documents showing he's been moving our assets into accounts I can't access. There are travel itineraries for him and Grace, property assessments, and business valuations. He's been planning this methodically while I've been planning our anniversary party. I heard Sophia's sharp intake of breath followed by the sound of her laptop keyboard clicking rapidly. Even in crisis, my lawyer daughter was already strategizing. "Mom, I'm driving down tomorrow. Don't confront him. Don't sign anything. And for God's sake, don't let him know you've discovered this. We need professional help, a private investigator, a forensic accountant, and the best divorce attorney in the state." Within 48 hours, Sophia had assembled what she called my liberation team. Marcus Webb, a private investigator who specialized in marital fraud. Catherine Morris, a forensic accountant who could trace money through shell corporations and offshore accounts. And Jennifer Park, a divorce attorney who'd built her reputation destroying men who tried to hide assets from their wives. "Mrs. Martinez," Jennifer said during our first meeting in her downtown office, "your husband has made several critical mistakes. First, he waited too long to file, which means you're entitled to claim spousal support based on 50 years of unpaid domestic labor. Second, he involved a third party in what appears to be both an affair and financial fraud. Third, he underestimated his opponent." "I'm not sure I qualify as much of an opponent," I said quietly. "I haven't worked in 50 years. I don't even have access to our bank accounts." Jennifer's smile was sharp as a blade. "Mrs. Martinez, you built a construction company from nothing while raising 2 children. You managed every aspect of your family's finances for decades. You survived your husband's cancer, bankruptcy, and emotional abuse. Don't confuse being suppressed with being weak." Marcus' investigation revealed the scope of Richard and Grace's deception within a week. They'd been having an affair for 3 years, using company funds to finance romantic getaways that were written off as business expenses. Grace had been systematically undermining my access to business information while positioning herself as Richard's business partner in ventures that legally belonged to our marital estate. The financial forensics were even more damning. Richard had been hiding income, undervaluing assets, and transferring money through a network of LLCs that Grace helped establish. The construction company I'd helped build was being secretly prepared for sale with profits destined for accounts that bore only Richard's name. But the most devastating discovery was personal rather than financial. Marcus had photographed Richard and Grace at romantic dinners, weekend getaways, and jewelry stores where Richard bought her expensive gifts. Jewelry I'd seen Grace wearing to business meetings. Gifts I'd assumed came from her own success. He bought her a diamond necklace worth more than your grocery allowance for 6 months, Marcus reported with professional detachment. Paid for with funds from your joint account. Every evening, I returned home and played the role of the devoted wife with an Oscar-worthy performance. I cooked Richard's favorite meals, asked about his day, and listened to him talk about Grace's invaluable contributions to the business, all while documenting every lie, every financial transaction, and every moment of cruelty. I photographed the expensive gifts in Grace's office when I delivered lunch to Richard. I recorded phone conversations where he discussed hiding assets. I saved every email and text message that revealed the scope of their planning. "Elena, you're brilliant at this," Sophia said one evening as we reviewed the evidence we'd collected. "You've been invisible for so long that Dad doesn't even think to hide his crimes from you." For 50 years, I'd been the woman behind the man, supporting his dreams while abandoning my own. Now, for the first time, my invisibility had become my greatest weapon. Richard had no idea that the woman he dismissed as ordinary was building a case that would cost him everything he'd stolen from me. The hunter had become the hunted, and he didn't even know the game had started. The revelation came through Marcus's investigation like a gift wrapped in justice. Richard and Grace hadn't just been planning to steal my life. They'd been spreading a carefully crafted narrative to justify it. The private investigators' recordings from their favorite restaurant revealed the full scope of their character assassination campaign. "Elena has been having some mental health issues." Richard's voice was clear on the audio file Marcus played in Jennifer's office. "The stress of my cancer really affected her stability. Grace has been so supportive, helping me understand that sometimes the kindest thing is to let someone go before they hurt themselves." Grace's response made my blood freeze. It's actually textbook behavior for women her age. Emptiness, Ness syndrome combined with the reality of losing their looks and purpose. The way she's been clinging to you, making all those paranoid accusations about our business relationship, it's classic projection. They'd been painting me as mentally unstable for months, seeding doubt about my competency in conversations with friends, business associates, and even our children. Richard had told Tom Henderson that I'd become obsessive and jealous. He'd mentioned to our neighbor, Mr. Garcia, that I'd been forgetting things and acting erratically. Grace had confided to her hairdresser, who happened to be friends with Mrs. Torres, that she was worried about Elena's grip on reality. "This is a deliberate campaign," Jennifer explained, her face grim with professional anger. "They're creating a narrative that would support claims of your mental incompetence in divorce proceedings. If you'd signed papers under duress, or while allegedly mentally unstable, Richard could have claimed the dissolution was for your own protection. But their plan had a fatal flaw. I wasn't mentally unstable, and I'd been documenting everything." Catherine, the forensic accountant, spread her findings across Jennifer's conference table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Mrs. Martinez, your husband has been committing tax fraud on a significant scale. These business trips with Grace that were written off as company expenses, they were romantic getaways. The consulting fees paid to Grace's LLC, they were actually payments for personal services. And this equipment purchase that supposedly went to the Peterson job site, the serial numbers traced to renovations on Grace's personal residence. Each discovery felt like a small earthquake, shifting the foundation of everything I'd believed about my marriage. Richard wasn't just leaving me. He'd been systematically stealing from us for years while I cooked his meals and managed his medication schedule. "There's more," Marcus added, consulting his notes. "Grace has been telling people she and Richard are planning to merge their businesses after his divorce is finalized. She's already been introducing herself as his business partner and life partner at industry events. They're not hiding this relationship, they're just hiding it from you." The cruelest revelation was that they'd underestimated my intelligence so completely they'd been careless with their crimes. Richard had used our joint credit card to pay for romantic dinners with Grace, thinking I was too ordinary to notice charges at restaurants we'd never visited together. Grace had printed business documents on our home printer, assuming I was too technologically inept to check the printing history. "They think you're stupid, Elena," Sophia said bluntly after reviewing the evidence. "Dad has been treating you like a helpless child for so long that he genuinely believes you're incapable of fighting back." But the most empowering discovery was financial. Richard had been hiding income, but he'd also been undervaluing assets in preparation for divorce. The construction company he claimed was struggling had actually been more profitable than ever. The retirement accounts he said were barely adequate were worth significantly more than he'd reported. Our home, which he had appraised at a suspiciously low value, was actually worth nearly double his assessment. "He's been playing chess while assuming you don't even know the rules," Jennifer observed with satisfaction. "But chess requires your opponent to be unaware of your strategy. Once they know you're playing, the game changes completely." That evening, when Richard came home late from another business dinner that reeked of Grace's perfume, I greeted him with the same gentle smile I'd worn for 50 years. "How was your meeting, dear?" I asked, setting his reheated dinner in front of him. "Productive," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Grace and I are exploring some exciting new opportunities." "That's wonderful," I replied, my voice steady and warm. "I'm so glad you have such good support." For the first time in years, I wasn't lying. His support system was about to become his downfall, and my silence had become my greatest weapon. The man who'd spent a year planning my destruction had no idea I'd spent 3 weeks planning his. The morning of our 50th anniversary dawned with the kind of golden light that photographers pray for, streaming through our kitchen windows and illuminating the breakfast table, where I'd laid out our best china. I'd set 2 place settings, arranged fresh flowers from our garden, and made Richard's favorite blueberry pancakes one last time. Everything looked perfect for what should have been the most romantic morning of our lives. Instead, it was going to be the morning I destroyed his. Richard came downstairs at 8:30, already dressed in his golf clothes rather than the anniversary outfit I'd carefully laid out for him. He barely glanced at the elaborate breakfast spread, pouring himself coffee and scrolling through his phone with the distracted air of a man who had somewhere more important to be. "This is lovely, Elena," he said absently. "But I can't stay long. Grace and I have an emergency meeting about the Williams contract. You understand?" "Of course." Even on our anniversary, Grace's needs superseded everything else. I watched him butter a pancake with mechanical efficiency, and for a moment, I felt genuinely sorry for the man who was about to lose everything he'd taken for granted. "Richard," I said quietly, placing a manila envelope beside his coffee cup. "Before you go, I have an anniversary gift for you." He looked up with mild curiosity, probably expecting the usual tie or aftershave I'd given him for decades. When he opened the envelope and saw the legal documents inside, his face went through a fascinating progression of emotions. Confusion, recognition, and finally the pale shock of a man realizing his secret had been discovered. "Elena, what is this?" "It's my counter-divorce filing," I said, my voice steady as a surgeon's scalpel. "I'm demanding full disclosure of all assets, alimony based on 50 years of unpaid domestic labor, and my rightful share of the business I helped build. I thought it was appropriate to serve you today, since you apparently wanted to surprise me with divorce papers on our anniversary." Richard's hand trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages. I could see him processing the implications, the forensic accounting requests, the asset preservation orders, the demand for immediate financial transparency. "Elena, you don't understand the complexity of our finances. Grace has been helping me optimize our—" "I understand perfectly." I interrupted him for the first time in 50 years, and the power of that simple act was intoxicating. "I understand that you and Grace have been playing chess while assuming I was too stupid to learn the rules. Unfortunately for you, I've been playing checkers, and I just jumped all your pieces." I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen where Marcus surveillance photos were displayed in crystal clarity. Richard and Grace at romantic dinners, embracing in hotel lobbies, shopping for jewelry together. His face drained of color as he scrolled through image after image of his secret life. "You see, Richard, when you dismissed me as just a penny counter, you forgot that I kept those books for 30 years. I know where every dollar came from and where it went. I know about the shell corporations, the hidden accounts, the business trips that were actually romantic getaways charged to our company. I set down a second folder, this one containing Catherine's forensic accounting report. I also know about the tax fraud, using marital assets to renovate Grace's home and calling it equipment purchases, writing off your affair as business expenses. The IRS is going to be very interested in those creative accounting practices. Richard's coffee cup clattered against his saucer as his hands shook. Elena, we can work this out. 50 years has to mean something. We can go to counseling. We can. 50 years did mean something, I said softly. It meant I was strong enough to survive being slowly erased by someone who saw me as disposable. It meant I learned to be invisible, which made me very good at seeing things you thought were hidden. I stood up and smoothed down my dress. Not the anniversary outfit I'd planned, but a sharp business suit Sophia had helped me choose. Your lawyer should have called you by now. I filed an hour ago. There's also been a complaint filed with the IRS regarding your creative business expenses. Oh, and your major clients received copies of the forensic accounting report this morning. Something about due diligence and their fiduciary responsibility to ensure they're not party to tax fraud. The color that had left Richard's face didn't return. You can't destroy everything we built together. We didn't build this together, Richard. I built it, and you systematically stole it while I wasn't looking. Now I'm taking back what was always mine. I gathered my purse and headed toward the door. The anniversary party is obviously. I called the caterer this morning. Surprisingly, they were very understanding about not wanting to celebrate a marriage that was legally dissolved a year ago. Elena, wait. I turned back one last time, looking at the man I'd loved for 50 years, now sitting alone at our breakfast table, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal. Thank you, Richard, for teaching me that I'm strong enough to survive losing everything, including my illusions about you. Some women might see that as a cruel lesson. I see it as a gift. The front door closed behind me with a quiet click that sounded like freedom. The phone call came 3 hours after I'd left Richard sitting in our kitchen, staring at the ruins of his carefully constructed deception. I was at Sophia's house helping her prepare for what would have been our anniversary celebration when Jennifer called with news that made even my experienced divorce attorney sound giddy with professional satisfaction. Elena, you need to sit down for this, Jennifer said, her voice buzzing with excitement. Richard's lawyer just called. They want to negotiate immediately. Not next week. Not after they've had time to strategize. Immediately. As in, they're driving to my office right now. I sank into Sophia's kitchen chair, watching my daughter's eyes widen as she caught my side of the conversation. What changed this morning? You said these cases usually take months to reach settlement discussions. The IRS complaint triggered an automatic audit of Martinez Construction, Jennifer explained. But that's not the best part. It turns out that when your husband transferred business assets to shell corporations with Grace as a co-owner, he inadvertently made her liable for any tax penalties or criminal charges. She's been calling his lawyer every 10 minutes since 9 this morning, demanding to know how to distance herself from his financial crimes. The irony was so perfect, I almost laughed. Grace, who had positioned herself as Richard's escape route from our marriage, was now scrambling to escape the legal consequences of their affair. The woman who'd helped him steal from our marital estate was discovering that crime, unlike romance, requires accountability. There's more, Jennifer continued. Marcus received a very interesting phone call an hour ago. Grace wanted to hire him to investigate Richard's financial history. Apparently, she's just realized she has no idea how deep his deception goes, and she's terrified she might be criminally liable for business practices she helped facilitate, but didn't fully understand. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of watching someone reap exactly what they'd sown. Grace had spent 3 years helping Richard undermine my financial security, and now she was discovering that aligning yourself with a man willing to betray his wife of 50 years doesn't guarantee your own safety. She's scared, Elena, Jennifer said. Really scared. She told Marcus that Richard assured her all the business restructuring was legal, that he had lawyers handling everything properly. Now she's finding out that those lawyers were apparently as fictional as Richard's respect for his marriage vows. The final piece of justice came from an unexpected source. Richard's own golf buddy, Tom Henderson, had called Marcus with information that made our case absolutely bulletproof. During their regular Thursday game, Richard had bragged about how he'd outsmarted Elena's penny-counting brain by moving assets she'd never think to look for. He'd laughed about how easy it was to deceive someone who trusted him completely. Tom recorded the conversation on his phone. Jennifer reported he said it bothered him so much that he couldn't sleep. And when he heard through the country club gossip network that I'd filed for divorce, he decided Richard's own words should be evidence against him. But the most satisfying twist was still unfolding. Richard's major clients, Henderson Construction, Peterson Development, and Morrison Commercial, had all received copies of Catherine's forensic accounting report as required by their corporate compliance policies. These weren't just business associates. They were companies with strict ethical standards that couldn't afford to be associated with tax fraud or financial impropriety. Peterson Development terminated their contract this morning. Jennifer said, Henderson Construction is demanding a full audit of all payments made to Martinez Construction over the past 3 years, and Morrison Commercial, they're considering filing their own complaint with the IRS to distance themselves from any potential criminal liability. I sat in Sophia's kitchen, surrounded by the anniversary decorations we'd been taking down, and realized that Richard's systematic destruction of our marriage had triggered the systematic destruction of everything he'd valued more than our relationship. The business he'd built with my labor, but credited to his vision, was crumbling under the weight of his own deception. The woman he'd chosen over me was desperately trying to escape the consequences of their crimes. The reputation he'd cultivated over 50 years was being shredded by his own recorded confessions. The beautiful thing, Jennifer concluded, is that we didn't have to destroy him. We just had to step out of the way and let him destroy himself. Sophia hung up the phone and looked at me with something between admiration and amazement. Mom, you didn't just win. You orchestrated the most elegant form of justice I've ever seen in 20 years of practicing law. For the first time in months, I smiled with genuine joy rather than polite performance. Your father taught me that actions have consequences, sweetheart. He just forgot that lesson applied to him, too. The call came on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized. I was in my new apartment, a bright, airy space with large windows overlooking the downtown park, purchased with money that was rightfully mine, when my phone rang with Richard's number. I almost didn't answer. For the first time in 50 years, I had the luxury of choosing whether or not to engage with my former husband. Elena. His voice was smaller than I remembered, stripped of the confident authority that had defined him for so long. We need to talk. I'm outside your building. I looked out my window and saw him sitting in his truck in the visitor parking area, the same pickup he'd driven for years while claiming we couldn't afford to replace my aging Honda. Even from 4 floors up, I could see his shoulders slumped in a way that suggested defeat rather than the commanding presence he'd once carried. Richard, everything that needed to be said was said in court. Our lawyers handled the details. There's nothing left to discuss. Please, Elena, just 5 minutes. I need you to understand. Understand what? That you loved me? That the affair was a mistake? That spending 3 years systematically stealing from our marriage was some kind of midlife crisis? I kept my voice steady, clinical even. I understand perfectly. You wanted a different life, and you took it. I hope it was worth what it cost you. But something in his voice, a broken quality I'd never heard before, made me curious rather than angry. Against my better judgment, I found myself saying, 5 minutes, the lobby. I'm not inviting you into my home. When I reached the lobby, Richard looked like he'd aged a decade in the 3 weeks since our divorce was finalized. His hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and there was a hollowness in his eyes that spoke of consequences finally catching up with choices. Elena, I made a terrible mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. He stood awkwardly by the glass doors, his hands shoved deep in his pockets like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. Grace left. The day after the settlement was announced, she packed up and moved to California. Said she couldn't handle the drama and legal complications of being with me. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, not even surprise. I'm sorry your exit strategy didn't work out the way you planned. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said. He stopped himself, perhaps finally realizing how pathetic it sounded to blame his mistress for his choices. I thought I could have both. The security of our marriage and the excitement of something new. I thought I was smart enough to manage both worlds. You thought I was stupid enough not to notice, I corrected quietly. There's a difference. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I could see him processing the changes. I was wearing a soft blue dress Sophia had helped me choose, my hair styled by a downtown salon instead of the chain shop I'd used for years to save money. I stood straighter, spoke clearer, took up space in a way I hadn't allowed myself to do in decades. You look different, he said finally. I look like myself, I replied. For the first time in years, I looked like Elena Martinez instead of Richard's wife. Elena, 50 years has to count for something. We could try counseling. We could work through this. I know I hurt you, but marriages survive affairs. People forgive, Richard. I interrupted gently. You didn't have an affair. You orchestrated a 3-year campaign to erase me from my own life while stealing everything we built together. That's not a marriage problem. That's a character problem. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. The business is failing. Without Grace's connections and your organizational skills, I can't keep up with the contracts. The IRS penalties are bankrupting me. I might lose the house. The house you tried to steal from me through fraudulent property assessments. Elena, please. I'm asking for help. Not money, not legal assistance, just forgiveness, a chance to prove I can be the husband you deserved. I looked at this man I'd loved for 50 years, this stranger who'd systematically destroyed everything good between us, and felt something I'd never expected to feel, pity mixed with profound relief. Richard, I forgive you, I said softly and watched hope flicker across his face. I forgive you because holding on to anger would poison the life I'm building. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean pretending the last 3 years didn't happen. It means I release you from the debt you owe my heart, and I release myself from the obligation to keep paying for your choices. Elena, I loved you completely for 50 years. I sacrificed my career, my independence, my identity to support your dreams. I stood by you through cancer, bankruptcy, and war, but I will not stand by and watch you destroy what's left of my life because yours didn't turn out the way you planned. I turned toward the elevator, then paused. Take care of yourself, Richard. I genuinely hope you find peace, but you'll have to find it without me. As the elevator doors closed between us, I saw him standing alone in my lobby, finally understanding that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. 6 months later, I sit in my favorite corner booth at Rosie's Cafe, a charming little place 3 blocks from my apartment that I discovered during one of my daily walks through downtown. The morning sun streams through vintage windows, casting warm light across the worn wooden tables and mismatched chairs that give this place its character. It's the kind of cafe I used to drive past for years, always meaning to stop, but never having the time or permission to enjoy something so simple as coffee alone in public. Mrs. Torres sits across from me, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of watching a friend bloom after decades of dormancy. We've been meeting here every Tuesday for 3 months now, a ritual that feels both new and ancient. The simple pleasure of 2 women sharing conversation without asking anyone's permission. Do you regret anything? She asks, stirring honey into her coffee with the deliberate movements of someone who has learned to savor small pleasures. It's the question everyone asks, usually with a mix of curiosity and concern, as if they expect me to collapse under the weight of my own independence. I touch the simple gold chain around my neck, a gift I bought for myself the day my divorce was finalized. It's not expensive or flashy, just a delicate piece that catches the light when I move, a quiet reminder that I exist independently of anyone else's approval or attention. I regret not leaving 30 years ago when I first became invisible, I say, watching a young couple at the counter argue over whether to order 1 pastry or 2. Probably worried about money the way Richard and I used to be when every dollar mattered. I regret accepting the first dismissive comment, the first eye roll, the first time he made me feel stupid for caring about something he didn't value. Mrs. Torres nods knowingly. She'd watched my marriage from her kitchen window for 23 years, probably seeing things I'd trained myself not to notice. But I continue, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. I don't regret the woman I became in the darkness. She was always there waiting for permission to shine. I just forgot to give it to her. Through the cafe window, I watched the flow of downtown life. Business people hurrying to meetings. College students bent over laptops. Elderly couples walking hand in hand with the comfortable ease of partnerships built on mutual respect rather than habit. Once, watching happy couples would have made me ache with loneliness. Now I feel curiosity about the lives unfolding around me, the stories I'm free to observe without needing to fit myself into them. What's next for you? Mrs. Torres asks, though she already knows. We've spent weeks talking about my plans, my dreams, the life I'm building from scratch at 68. I pull out the letter that arrived yesterday. Official confirmation of my nursing license reinstatement. After 50 years away from the profession I'd loved, I'm going back to work. Not because I need the money, though the settlement ensures I'll never be financially dependent on anyone again, but because I miss the purpose, the competence, the feeling of being essential to outcomes that matter. St. Mary's Hospital called yesterday. I tell her, unable to hide my excitement. They have an opening in their pediatric unit. Apparently, there's something valuable about nurses who've raised children who understand that healing involves more than just medical procedures. Mrs. Torres beams with pride, and I realize how rarely anyone had shown pride in my choices during my marriage. Richard had been proud of what I could do for him, but never proud of who I was as an individual. Love shouldn't require you to disappear, Helen, I say, using words that have become my personal manifesto. It should help you become more yourself, not less. The morning light shifts as clouds move across the sun. And I think about the young woman I was 50 years ago, the confident nurse who believed she could handle any crisis, who saw marriage as an addition to her life rather than a replacement for it. She's still here, just older and infinitely wiser about the difference between love and self-erasure. On my kitchen table at home, divorce papers lie next to my new nursing license renewal application and a small stack of thank you cards from the pediatric patients I've been volunteering with during my license review process. Children don't care that I'm 68 or that my marriage failed. They care that I listen when they're scared, that I remember which stuffed animal brings them comfort, that I show up consistently in their uncertain world. Some stories end with revenge. I tell Mrs. Torres as we prepare to leave, gathering our purses and pulling on our coats. Mine ends with remembering who I was before I forgot I mattered. As we step outside into the crisp morning air, I feel something I haven't experienced in decades, anticipation for tomorrow that has nothing to do with anyone else's needs or dreams. At 68, I'm not starting over. I'm starting fresh with the wisdom that comes from surviving your own disappearance and choosing to rebuild rather than retreat. The woman who once counted herself lucky to be invisible has learned the power of being seen.